Good afternoon. I'm a moderator for this session. I'm Taeho Park. I'm a professor at Seoul National University. Actually, I'm not an expert on finance, but the organizer asked me to do moderating function, so I'm here. The topic of this panel discussion is geopolitics of finance, quite important topic. I read the description of the panel. We might like to discuss a few important issues related to the current status as well as future challenges of the global financial system. We all know that the major countries, especially the participants of the G20, seriously discussed about the reform and the restructuring of the global financial system since the global financial crisis, which took place in 2008. However, in recent years, the momentum as well as the willingness to implement reform measures for the global financial system seem to be drifting. Well, as a moderator for this session, I would like to suggest a few topics for our panel discussions. Of course, these are my own suggestions, so the panelists can discuss any issues related to the global financial system. The first topic I would like to raise is the issue related to the unconventional monetary policy we call quantitative easing or many other terminologies of major countries such as the United States and Japan, and more recently maybe EU and even China. So when and how those nations able to normalize their unconventional monetary policy without having much negative impacts on other countries, especially large emerging economies. The second topic I would like to suggest is the restructuring of the IMF quotas. The US Congress did not approve the agreement reached on the restructuring of the IMF quotas at the G20 summit meeting held in Seoul in 2010. How do we see this issue? How about the future prospect on this issue? Lastly, but not least, I would like to suggest, which might be related to the previous second topic I raised, is about AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, initiated by China. How do you see the US position on this? How about Japanese position? Any recommendation you'd like to make to China? This is all I would like to say to set the stage for our panel discussion. And according to the organizer, the moderator will ask each panel to speak about 8 minutes as introductory remarks. And then maybe we can talk a little bit among us, and then I'll open the floor for interaction with the audience. So let me, and about the bios of the participants, you can refer to the program book. I don't want to spend too much time on introducing the speakers. Let me first invite Mr. Troy Stangeron of the KEI, Korea Economic Institute.
Thank you very much, Dr. Park. Well, we've had a great deal of interesting discussion this morning, in terms of is the U.S. back, how have things changed, and different perspectives on that. And I guess to sort of start and to frame my discussion, I'd like to take sort of a broader scope, sort of like Dr. Hammond mentioned in the last session, going from pre-Westphalia to today, but in a different sense in that, I think when we often look at the question of, is the system changing, is the United States declining, is it back, is it not, we tend to look from reference points, fixed points in time at our current point in time, to when, in the grand scheme of things, what we're actually seeing is slow transitions and changes that are constantly taking place. And eventually, as those transitions become more significant, they start pushing systems in different directions. So, I think one great way to look at this is, you've all probably seen the time-lapse maps that show sort of example like changes in trade or changes in GDP growth. And if you look at those, you can go back to, post-World War II or something, and you can see the contents of the country shrink and grow, over time. And so when we're thinking about, be it trade, be it finance, be it anything, systems are constantly evolving, they're constantly facing new pressures, and they're constantly changing. So in some ways, the question is where are we in this sort of moment of transition, and how is the transition taking place? And I think the issues you put up, are very sound ones. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis and Lehman Brothers collapse, we've really seen unconventional methods like QE come into play. And the question then becomes sort of, when we talk about the future of global finance, there are sort of, I think, two broader aspects to this. One is, the financial reform. So, the immediate changes after the crisis, fixing the banks, recapitalizing, getting rid of the bad loans, taking and moving derivatives, at least where possible, into exchanges to increase transparency. These different types of steps that were taken to sort of buttress and reinforce the financial system more broadly. But the other question then, which is one of the things that we were asked to talk about, is the distributional aspect of the resources. In other words, how can these resources be best deployed in terms of helping growth and helping development around the world? And this is where I think the Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank comes in as sort of a good example. Right now, if you look at, Asia, the Asia Development Bank has estimated that the region needs up to, $800 billion worth of investment in infrastructure each year through 2020. India itself needs roughly 200 billion of that. So there are significant needs. So the question then becomes, when we look at the changing system and the changing structure, where does this investment bank that China's proposed fit in? Well, my first comment would be it's mostly inadequate. There's not going to be the capital needed to take and meet the needs of the region. So, perhaps we're making a larger perspective of this than, others might say. I think it was Larry Summers, and if it wasn't him, I apologize, but he had said, this is the sign of the beginning of the end of U.S. collapse. This sort of cataclysmic kind of remark. I think, oftentimes this is sort of overblown. Now, China isn't doing a lot of different things. There are all kinds of initiatives from the Silk Road Initiative to the Maritime Silk Road. And when you start combining all these together and look at sort of a broader Chinese structure of trying to reorder economic interaction within the region and create a coherence of policies amongst different countries, then there are larger issues. But the bank itself, in isolation, is something that, to be frank, I think the United States has played wrong. If we look at this from a U.S. perspective, we have, over the last 3 decades, followed a policy of engagement with China. And under that policy, we've encouraged China, as Bob Zoellick stated, to be a responsible stakeholder. Well, there's 2 challenges to that. One is that means the United States needs to be open to Chinese initiatives. And 2, at the same time, the United States needs to do things to bring China within the system. And so this gets into the quota reform that you discussed. And so when we think about this, why has this happened? Well, there's a couple challenges I think that we face in the United States, and they're political in nature. One is that there is a high degree of partisanship on Capitol Hill. There is a lack of any desire to take and pass the quota reforms of the IMF through Congress. Some of it is partisan, some of it is perhaps a misperception of the United States' place in the world and how the world is changing. But at the same time, we need to take and engage. And so when we ask the question, why did the United States not engage China on the bank? Well, I think the real challenge in this situation is that we were not sure how to handle this. One of the things that I think we face is a question of, China has grown. We have followed a policy, but we have not really thought in the United States of how we're going to actually then interact when China does reach a certain point of development. And so when the AIIB came about, there was a reflex reaction of, well, this is duplicative, will it meet the standards that we need? And, if the standards were the real issue, the goal would have been engage, push the Chinese to do the standards that are needed and ensure that takes place. And the bank could still end up not meeting those standards. For any of you who read the Nelson Report, there was a piece about a week ago suggesting that China's decided that all of the procurement will go to Chinese companies. I think that's probably unlikely. If that were to be the case, a lot of the other countries would probably start leaving. So, it's going to be a struggle to take and pull this in together. But, these are the kind of challenges we face. And so if you're thinking about this long term, the question of U.S. leadership in finance is really one of taking and managing situations better. We've clearly mismanaged the situation with the AIIB, but we've managed many others much better. TPP right now, you see a struggle to get to the issues, but we've tried to address Chinese concerns about whether, how the agreement will affect the region, try to take and consult with China in terms of bringing them in at some point in the future. A more cooperative and engaging manner will work much better than one where we simply take and say, this is the system and it's not going to change. Because the reality is that the world has changed. China has much greater resources. It needs to deploy that capital. And with that, we need to adjust. And so the real question is how will our politics allow us to move forward on this? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, let me just quickly to the next speaker, Mr. Soktae Oh, we call Oh Soktae, Mr. Oh, from Societe Generale. I want to.
I think maybe considering my background, I would answer mostly on the question one about the QE. So, if I remember 6 or 7 years ago, back then, right after the global financial crisis, the QE, suddenly became a household word. And back then, people think that is very kind of, emergency, solution. People somehow think that, maybe we could have this kind of unconventional measures only in limited places like the US, and only in the limited time, maybe around 1 or 2 years. But 6 years have been passed, and right now we feel that, of course, yes, there was 3 times of QE in the United States, and the third one just ended just recently. And then we had the QE in Japan. And recently, actually, from the spring, we also have the QE in Europe. And then we even heard the rumor that there could be a QE in the Chinese version. Of course, it could be a bit different from the other countries. So the bottom line is that right now, it seems that the QE is happening everywhere, and at least in the major economy. And maybe the more important thing is that even though it is billed or claimed as an unconventional measures, it seems that it's become conventional or normal. The new normal is another, household word in the global financial market. And it seems that the QE is a critical part of that new normal. So, yes. Anyway, we, especially in the participant in the financial market, believe that the QE is the critical, the factor in the recent bull market and the global stock and also the bond market. So, from the viewpoint of the economists like myself, this is actually not a normal situation. Some people call it the new normal, but from an ordinary macroeconomist, this is still unconventional. The central bank cannot buy the government bond or private sector asset indefinitely. There should be a limit, and the central bank should eventually escape from this kind of unconventional situation. So the question is how the central banks in the world, at least in the major economies, can exit or escape from the current situation. I think that's the key and crucial question in the financial market, as well as the global economy as a whole, maybe in the next 5 years. So, as an economist, I don't like QE, but that has become a kind of the one of the key factors in the global financial market. So, how to exit from the situation is a critical question, and for that matters, I think the so-called supranational institutions like IMF or maybe G20, that should be an important institution to handle all the situation, because basically still we have a concern that what if the US suddenly start to raise the interest rate while everybody else is still cannot do that kind of the policy normalization. So maybe in the next 5 years, the proper coordination of the global central bank and maybe the global the countries, the government of the major economies, the coordination should be very important. And then the what concerns us is that, as you mentioned, the IMF reform that was proposed a few years ago is still up in the air because of the U.S. politics. So I think that, of course, the politics, we are headed into another U.S. election, presidential election. So maybe chances of the reform done on the IMF looks pretty low. But anyway, I think to face this kind of risk and to handle the situation of the how we're gonna properly exit from this unconventional measures of QE, I think that this kind of the IMF reform and maybe the reform on the global financial organization in general should be very important. And the last question, AIIB. Frankly speaking, I believe that the AIIB is somehow, I think, the over is hyped or maybe overestimated, relative to its maybe true functions or maybe to true, the structure. Still, it's very in the primitive stage, and right now I believe that would not be totally driven by the China alone, because we have lots of member countries, and maybe Japan would also join this AIIB. So maybe this could be very helpful to develop, especially the regions like the Southeast Asia or the South Asia. But as a alternative, the global financial institution, frankly speaking, I don't think that it would really be an alternative of IMF or World Bank or even ADB. So,
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your keeping the time. Next speaker is Dr. Ben Steil from the Council on Foreign Relations. Please.
Back in October 2013, after the so-called taper tantrum in emerging markets, the IMF produced a fascinating study looking at which emerging economies had best weathered the period of unconventional monetary policy in the United States. And they found that the countries that did weather it best had three primary characteristics. First of all, they had a low level of foreign ownership of domestic assets. They were running persistent current account surpluses, and they had large foreign exchange reserves. It's pretty easy to extract a policy agenda out of this. You would say to emerging market policymakers that in good times, the government should apply a firm hand to keep the currency down and imports down, and foreign exchange reserves and exports up. The problem is that any such policy agenda runs head-on into opposition from the U.S. Congress, which considers this to be the definition of so-called currency manipulation. And so it's not surprising that you're seeing enormous trade tensions beginning to develop. TPP, for example, is being held up in the United States by opposition in Congress, with a lot of support from major U.S. exporters, particularly in the auto industry, who want so-called anti-currency manipulation provisions to be inserted into all future U.S. trade agreements. Now, against this backdrop, it's not particularly surprising that large emerging market countries such as China are demanding reforms to the multilateral financial institutions, in particular the IMF and the World Bank. Those are being held up by one particular institution, the U.S. Congress. And to be rather blunt, diplomatically for us in the United States, particularly in our diplomatic dealings with China, this was our Yasukuni. Many of you may remember how China brilliantly and ruthlessly exploited Japanese Prime Minister Abe's visit to Yasukuni by arguing to the international community that this was proof that Japan was the primary threat to peace and stability in the region and not China. Of course, that wasn't Prime Minister Abe's purpose in going to Yasukuni. He was appealing to a domestic audience. But likewise, in the United States, I've yet to meet a Republican congressman who objects to IMF reform that has anything to say about China and blocking China's rise. That was not the issue. The issue is a perennial one in the United States, that there are parts of the Republican right that simply object to giving more resources to what they consider to be a multilateral bailout institution. And this goes back to the founding of the IMF and the World Bank after World War II, when there was very, very significant Republican opposition to the creation of these institutions. But I think China has exploited this very, very effectively to argue in particular to America's allies that we've been perfectly reasonable here. This obstinance from the United States is a clear indication that we need new institutions to give voice to rising powers, and that such institutions are therefore both necessary and inevitable. And given that context, I think it was a particularly appalling diplomatic mistake of the Obama administration to publicly oppose its allies becoming founding members of the institution. And whatever the situation might have been, say, a year ago, it's particularly, in my view, nonsensical now for the U.S. to oppose Japanese membership. In fact, I would argue that the Obama administration should be forcefully pushing Japan to join. Why? We don't yet know very much about what the governance of the new AIIB will be, but China has indicated the outlines of a voting formula. And under the current membership structure, China would have approximately 43% of the vote. The next largest member would be India with only 9% of the vote. If you took all the close U.S. allies combined, that is European Union countries and in the Asia Pacific, South Korea and Australia, they would only have 28% of the vote. Now with Japan in as a member, this changes dramatically. Japan would be by far the second largest member with about 15% of the vote. And if you add up all the votes of close U.S. allies within the organization, it would be approximately 41%, and China will go down to 35%. So if the U.S. objective, which is pretty logical at this point, is to limit China's dominance of the AIIB, it is only common sense, in my view, for the United States to support Japan's entry, even if the United States itself does not join. I would also argue that the intense spotlight that's on AIIB at the moment really derives from this fascinating politics going on, and it has much less to do with the economics of the initiative, which I would argue are rather overblown. One argument China makes for the necessity of this institution is that the World Bank is not currently focused on infrastructure. It's shifted its focus over time towards poverty reduction. If you actually go on the World Bank's website and find out what the World Bank is doing, particularly in China, you'll find that this is not true at all. The two largest members of the AIIB, China and India, are also the two largest borrowers from the World Bank. China currently owes the World Bank $17.4 billion. And if you look at the projects that the World Bank is funding in China, they are overwhelmingly major infrastructure projects. So you can actually make, I think, a pretty compelling argument that what China is doing in the current environment is borrowing cheap from the West through the World Bank and then redirecting the funds through the AIIB to its own Silk Road geostrategic infrastructure initiatives in the Asia Pacific. But then I think the important question to ask is, Are there actually fantastic infrastructure investment opportunities in the region right now that are not being funded because of lack of capital? And I would argue that that's actually implausible. The world right now is awash in excess savings. It is clear that we have deficient demand in the global economy. That's reflected in, for example, the negative interest rates you're seeing in some developed markets. Much of Asia as well is awash in excess debt. Against that backdrop, it is difficult to argue that the crying need in the region is to put more investment behind expanding the supply capacity for the global economy. That's a pretty tough argument to make. So what I would argue is that it's therefore quite likely that the AIIB investments will actually be quite high risk and that the funding will be underpriced. So I don't accept China's argument that this is fundamentally necessary from an economic perspective at the moment. Now, just a few comments on the U.S. To close, the theme of the conference is the U.S. back? One way to look at this is if you go back over the past 15 years, back to 2000, and you plot the gap between emerging market growth rates and the U.S. growth rate, what you find is a giant triangle. From 2000 to 2008, the gap between emerging markets and the United States was growing very steadily. But after the financial crisis, which of course paradoxically started in the United States, you see that gap fall back very, very sharply. And it's continued to the present day. So that currently, that gap between emerging market growth rates and the U.S. growth rate is right back to where it was in 2000 at below 2%. So by that measure, yes, indeed, the U.S. is back. If you look at other measures, though, let's focus specifically on finance, the role of the U.S. dollar and the institutions that shepherd it, in particular the U.S. Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury, have actually become far more significant since the financial crisis. By far the most important global crisis firefighting weapon we saw used during the crisis was central bank currency swaps, particularly those initiated by the Federal Reserve. They were far more important, for example, than anything that the IMF did. You can argue that there would be no European banking system right now had it not been for the currency swaps provided by the U.S. Federal Reserve. It's interesting that the United States extended currency swaps to only 4 emerging market central banks, Korea, Singapore, Brazil, and Mexico. Korea made use of it. Its banking sector during the crisis had the largest dollar gap. It borrowed about $16.4 billion from the Fed. And interestingly, it had the possibility of borrowing money through the so-called Chiang Mai initiative multilateralization. It could have borrowed the money locally, and it chose not to. And that shows a fundamental flaw in my view in Chiang Mai, that if you want to borrow more than 20% of your quota, you have to be on an IMF program. And nobody wants to be on an IMF program, particularly in this country. Now, China has tried to replicate what the U.S. has done in expanding currency swap arrangements across the globe. Since 2009, it's actually signed 28 such agreements. But virtually none of these swap lines have actually been used. The most interesting use of the PBOC's currency swap lines was late last year when Argentina borrowed money from China through its central bank. And you might ask, what does Argentina need to borrow Chinese currency for? Nothing. It sold the RMB in the market for US dollars. Looking forward, how might this be used again? If Russia should get into financial crisis, where would it turn? It would be very difficult for Russia to turn to the IMF in the current political environment. The U.S. And its European allies are unlikely to support Russia. Russia has a swap line with the PBOC worth about $24 billion at current exchange rates, I could certainly imagine Russia doing the same thing. That is borrowing RMB from China, but then immediately selling it for dollars, which is still the only currency that countries need in a crisis.
Okay, thank you very much. We just completed the first round of remarks by each speaker. Among us, while you hear from others, do you have any questions or comments to make to each other? Maybe Troy?
Well, I thought, Ben's point about, is there really this great demand for infrastructure in the region right now is sort of a good one. I think there's a difference between looking at, potential economic growth plans and saying, well, if we were to develop the region this way, how much would we need and how do we get there? And what are actual shovel-ready projects? To give an example of this, when the crisis hit, one of the challenges the United States faced when we took and did a large fiscal stimulus was, there weren't really enough fiscal or shovel-ready, as they say, projects available. So the question is there might be things we want to do in the long run. We might understand that in the long run, Malaysia may need additional ports at some point or something of that nature, but there may not really be that existing need right now for large amounts of funding. So I think that's an important distinction to make when talking about this.
But is there many, maybe not immediate demand, but huge demand for infrastructure in newly emerging countries in ASEAN, for example, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia. I think China wants to have some influence in that kind of areas through this, kind of project. I don't know. I mean, this not immediately. Maybe you don't need this, but in the future, maybe you need that kind of influence. And also, the rivalry between China and Japan at the ADB. ADB has a limitation in terms of resources, but in terms of governance, China is not always, making its own kind of legitimate influence because of the rivalry with Japan. So there will be some competition between ADB and AIIB in any case, I think. Any other? Yes.
So you raised a question that whether there is enough demand for the new institution like AIIB to handle or to satisfy especially in the South Asian region. And I have one friend actually in AMRO in Singapore, the Asian Monetary Research Office, and his answer is that from his point of view, at least in the Southeast Asia, there's still many the project that has to be done. But what I think is that maybe I basically agree with your view. Maybe the money itself, or capital itself, is not the major problem. The real problem should be found rather in the institutional one. If you build the infrastructure, basically who would fund it, and if it is built on for example, in the toll basis, how to just collect the return of the investment. I think that's the key issue, and I'm not quite sure whether this new institution would really manage all that kind of institutional problems and the projects. For example, I think that in some the part of the world still I think how to properly just secure the land for the road itself, that could be a problem in the country like I think I heard it in India, for example. So yes, this region, basically the Southeast Asia and the India or the South Asia, clearly need more infrastructure, but what they really need is not another bank, but maybe more kind of this institutional reform that cannot necessarily be done by just another big the regional the financial institutions. So for that matter, I'm still kind of I doubt whether that kind of another big bank is really needed. And for your point, you basically think that Japan should also join this, the AIIB, right?
From the narrow strategic U.S.
Yeah,
perspective.
but I think so. The reason why AIIB suddenly becomes the buzzword in Korea is that basically people think that this, in terms of the national security, Korea should be close ally of the United States, while in terms of the economic ties, Korea need to do more closely with China. But my idea is a bit different. Of course, I know that right now the relationship between Korea and Japan is maybe its worst in over maybe 50 or 60 years. But my own idea is that to really properly control this new institution, I think that of course, from the U.S. point of view, maybe to proper control of that thing is important. But maybe from our point of view, to really control China, my crazy idea is that maybe Korea and Japan should closely cooperate with this new institution to really, to really just control China. China from the beginning, China thinks that maybe it's our own institution, but we need to maybe properly control and properly direct this new institution. And Korea, decides to join this institution, and if Japan also join, I think that maybe in some points, I think Korea and Japan would closely cooperate and maybe match our voice if there's some issues, especially I think from the private sector's point of view, we don't believe China's own capability in the finance industry. So I think that from that point of view, as a kind of developed member in this Asian region, Korea and Japan in some issues can share and maybe have a same voice in the new institution.
Okay, before Ben, you want to respond to the comments made by the two gentlemen.
very
But before you do that, let me just add one more question to you. At the moment, then China doesn't want Japan to join right now, or
No, they do.
They do?
No, in fact, this is what I think should be one area of agreement between the United States and China, even if it's for different reasons. China reportedly has even offered Japan a sweetener that is the number 2 post in this institution if Japan would join. From a U.S. geostrategic perspective, I think Mr. O raises another reason why the United States should support Japanese membership, because the U.S. has tried in many contexts to improve cooperation between Japan and Korea. Broadly speaking, I think it's failed so far. But this might be an opportunity where Japanese and Korean interests are very much aligned. So again, all the more reason for the Obama administration to change course.
do you want to add anything on new demand for infrastructure in this region, project?
Only that I'm not persuaded that it's lack of capital that explains why these projects are not being funded. The capital is copiously available in the present environment. Credible private borrowers are borrowing funds around the world, and credible sovereigns as well, borrowing money around the world at record low interest rates. So I think if you're looking for a reason why these great projects are not being funded, they are in fact high risk. And I go back to the second point that I made earlier, that a lot of countries in the region also have very worrying debt profiles. So, China has made major concessions in terms of the governance structure of the organization to get American allies on board. In particular, they've forsworn taking a veto And of course, the U.S. has veto power within both the IMF and the World Bank. But I think it's going to be very important for countries like Korea to make sure that they protect their investments in this organization, because, again, this is not the sort of economic environment in which you would expect to see major new investments in increasing supply capacity.
Okay, at this moment, I'd like to open the floor for interactions. If I ask, please identify your name and affiliation very briefly, and also you should limit the time when you raise questions or comment. The gentleman first, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Salam Fayyad. I'm chairman of Future for Palestine. Let me first commend the panelists for having demystified what otherwise has been a most disingenuous debate in public about the AIIB. Certainly, it's not, to my way of thinking, need for an institution, yet another institution, in order to have more investment in infrastructure or anything like that. But at the same time, on the other side of this argument, is the worry about governance and standards. I think that too is disingenuous. Getting into the issue in the way that happened during this exchange, as well as its earlier session, does a lot, I think, to explain much of the tension that really has led to the emergence or to this idea or coming up with this new institution, so to speak. I'm glad you mentioned something about foregoing veto power. I don't know if China would need it that much if it still retains 35% of the voting share in the institution. It depends on the other articles of association in terms of what would be necessary in order to make certain decisions. To be honest with you, I myself find it necessary for there to be some serious thinking as to what led China to do this, in addition to China's rise in the world economy, the fact that the world order has changed, economically speaking, so to speak, without there being a serious attempt at re-examining an architecture of international financial dealings, commerce, investment, if you will, that dates back 70 years without much change. The fact that U.S. Congress has very much for a long time blocked reform, so-called IMF reform, I think is a key contributor to this debate. I think what really would be important is for there to be a meeting, a serious discussion of what actually led China to do what it did, and try to address those concerns. And those concerns, you will find, are not China's alone. On QEs, just as an example of rigid international architecture that has failed repeatedly. QEs became popular, maybe necessary programs throughout in the immediate aftermath of international financial crisis. But as a gentle reminder, a very high form, advanced form of QEs was advanced, promoted for a long period of time, provided for under the existing Articles of Association of the International Monetary Fund, namely SDR allocation. And it was blocked repeatedly forever. It was not until it became interest of powers to be, economically and politically speaking, that all of a sudden QEs became admissible into discourse. Some ideas I thought I would contribute to this debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll collect some more questions. Yeah. Yes, the lady, please.
Thanks. I'm Ellen Lapson from the Stimson Center. I'd like to go back to the issue of what was the purpose of proposing reforms to the IFIs, and whether was it basically greater inclusiveness, fairness, acknowledgement of redistribution of power in the international system. Do you think the reforms, if we didn't have the U.S. Congress as a barrier, would make a difference in preventing a future financial crisis and in addressing the growing global problem of maldistribution of income? Would those reforms make a difference, or would we need something in addition to those reforms? Thanks.
Thank you. And one more, Professor Choi.
My name is Choi Beng-il. I'm professor at Ewha Women's University. Since there is no Chinese panelist, I'm trying to represent Chinese view, even though I'm not quite sure I'm very good at it. Ben, you mentioned what China is going to do at AIIB is borrow a very cheap loan from World Bank and using as vehicle at AIIB and lend it to many Asian countries. Well, I don't think that is going to really happen, because if anyone can see through, and if China is going to maintain a dominant equity position AIIB, and I don't think any board members in World Bank is going to let it happen. So I want to just hear from your view. And I have two questions to any panelist. The first question is about currency manipulation. As economist, I have trouble of understanding these currency manipulations. Because when you recall early 1980s, there was a Plaza Agreement under which some dominant Western powers, they pressed some emerging countries, which was West Germany and Japan at the time, and they tried to totally revalue their currency. And under assumption that these countries are manipulating their currency. And that happens 30 years ago, but that's in the Cold War era. But now we have different economic system. And now you mentioned the IMF come up with some kind of three important characteristics of emerging country which could overcome crisis. But that three essential elements turn out to be evidence of manipulating currency by politicians. So how that is going to link? And also perhaps I can ask Troy in Washington right now and TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, some congressmen, they want to add this currency manipulation in the final bill, even though that is not going to be successful this time. Eventually, there's possibility of putting this currency manipulation as trade sanction argument. So I'm not quite convinced how that is going to be successful, even if you're going to identify. And second question is...
Can you clarify your World Bank question? Your World Bank question. I wasn't clear.
Yeah, World Bank question was, you mentioned China is going to borrow
Yes,
cheap
sir.
from World Bank,
Yeah.
and then using as a vehicle AIIB, and then lending to many Asian
Right.
countries. But I have difficult understanding that argument, even after AIIB is going to be up and flying. There was questions. And the second question is about China's ambition about making renminbi as a global currency. Perhaps Ben is going to be perfect person to answer this question, because there are historical tendency correlation as countries are rising on global stage, becoming the most powerful nation, and then we naturally assume that country's currency is going to globally circulate key currency. So do you think that's going to happen in China? Or if that happens, the US has some kind of counter strategy to delay that kind of thing? Or I'll put it a different way, why will it take China to make renminbi as global currency? Thank you.
Okay, we heard three speakers from the floor, and I will just turn to panelists. Why don't you pick up what you would like to respond, starting with Troy.
Okay. Well, why don't we start with the currency manipulation debate in Washington, D.C. and its prospects? Well, one of the interesting things that we're seeing now is how, to a degree, this is becoming a bipartisan issue, in that the primary piece of legislation in the Senate was co-sponsored by Debbie Stabenow of Detroit and Rob Portman, former USTR of Ohio. Now, there is one thing they have in common, which they're both from manufacturing states that have been in decline and that see foreign competition as a challenge. But I think the interesting thing is there's also a different approach in the House and in the Senate. In the House, you've still had this desire to put this legislation on TPA. The Senate actually passed its currency manipulation bill on the customs authorization bill, and it didn't make it through on the TPA. Now the question is going to become what will happen if you get to a conference point. But I think we're likely to see, even if it's just a nominal type of thing, a push more in this direction, because it's something that's coming up more consistently and that key individuals in both parties are pushing. I don't think it'll be in the TPA legislation, though, so it won't be part of our negotiating authority. Where this is going to go, I don't know, but there are political changes going on that are pushing this further along than one would expect.
Okay, Mr. Oh.
Yeah, maybe I would answer the question about the renminbi internationalization. Yes, we all know that the China's government and authorities try to make the renminbi as a kind of the renminbi internalization is the goal of the Chinese government. But there's one critical question. For the one currency to become really a international currency, there should be a investment vehicle that anybody in the world can safely save his fortune as that the specific currency. Right now the U.S. dollar is the most important currency, and we all know the instrument, which is the U.S. Treasury bond. But in case of renminbi, yes, China does have their own government bond, but unfortunately, Chinese capital market is still not open to the rest of the world. So we cannot really buy the Chinese, the government bond denominated by the renminbi. So the simple conclusion is that if you consider the stage of development in the Chinese financial market, I don't think that the Chinese renminbi would become the status as the same as maybe even the Australian dollar. I think within 10 or 20 years, can renminbi be really kind of that kind of international currency like Aussie dollar? I don't think so. So, from the private market point of view, yes, I know that the Chinese government is really pushing hard to renminbi as a form of, for example, the transaction, especially the trade transaction. When I was in the Citibank and especially in Standard Chartered, I noticed that the Chinese authorities pushing very hard for the renminbi internalization. But as far as I know, what is really important is the capital market. Yes, the one currency is used in the trade transaction, but as far as I know, the currency is used in the trade thing is maybe less than 10% of all the currency transaction. Basically, the FX market is for the traders, speculators, whatever, or the capital market investors. For that matter, Chinese financial market is still really underdeveloped. So, yes, we know the China's goal, and maybe they hope that this AIIB could be another, building block for the renminbi internationalization. But my thinking is that maybe it takes a bit more time, longer time, for the renminbi to become a key currency in the global financial market.
Okay, Ben?
On the question of IMF reforms, I don't believe that IMF governance reforms would have a major impact on preventing crises, because that would require a fundamental change in the international monetary architecture, and I don't see the United States agreeing to that anytime soon. I'll talk about this a bit tomorrow at the lunch talk, but despite the mythology of Bretton Woods, that it was 44 nations gathering around a table and deliberating. It was nothing of the sort. It was the United States dictating terms to another global financial power, Great Britain, which Great Britain had to accept because it was going bankrupt during the war. The United States is not in that position today, and there is no institution that can force it to somehow relinquish the international role of the dollar. But I do think these governance reforms could be quite significant in terms of the crises that the IMF chooses to intervene on. If you take two very controversial crises where the IMF has been conspicuously involved since the crisis, Greece and Ukraine, I think you can make very compelling arguments in both cases that the IMF as such should not have been involved. In the case of Greece, there were clearly sufficient resources available within the Eurozone to deal with that problem. And the Germans like to lecture us all on moral hazard. But we, the international community, created moral hazard by agreeing to participate in an ill-thought-out Greek bailout, and gave Germany and the other northern Eurozone creditors time to delay negotiating what sort of architecture they needed within the Eurozone to ensure that crises like this didn't happen again. So I think Greece should have been a matter for the Eurozone to deal with. In the case of Ukraine, I mean, the conditionality being imposed by the IMF is utterly ridiculous because Ukraine is a war zone. By all means, certainly we in the West, who consider ourselves allies of Ukraine, should be intervening to assist them, but that should not be, in my view, the role of the IMF. And I think if the institution were less European-dominated, then you would have perhaps not gotten those two interventions. And so that would be the main effect of IMF reforms, to reduce the power of the old European powers. I should emphasize that any IMF governance reform that gives more votes to countries with higher GDP actually gives more votes to the United States, not fewer votes. With regard to the question of currency manipulation, I think it's worth putting it in a broader context. U.S. understanding of this issue has changed very dramatically over time. For example, just before the financial crisis, Senators Lindsey Graham and Charles Schumer, a Republican and a Democrat, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in which they argued, and I'm quoting, that a fundamental tenet of international trade is that currencies should float. Try explaining this to Adam Smith. Try explaining this to even John Maynard Keynes. Nobody believed this until very, very recently, basically when the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the United States was absolutely adamant that the world should have fixed exchange rates and that countries with current account surpluses should not be exposed to any sort of international discipline. Fast forward to today, and the United States takes a completely different position. Why? In 1944, the United States was concerned about other countries devaluing against the US dollar. Now we're concerned about other countries preventing a revaluation of their currency. So we supported fixed exchange rates then, we support floating exchange rates now, but for the same reason, in order to get a more competitive US dollar. Also in 2010, former Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner actually came out publicly in support of imposing caps on persistent current account surpluses. These are the ideas that Keynes and the British put forward at Bretton Woods, in which the United States violently objected to. With regard to the RMB as a global reserve currency, I would just try to put this in perspective. The United States right now, its currency, the US dollar, accounts for about 63% of global reserves, and in return, foreign official institutions control about 36% of the US Treasury market. If the Chinese RMB share of global reserves were only to rise to 5%, a mere 5%, foreign official institutions would already control 30% of the Chinese sovereign bond market. So in order for China to support a global RMB, they are going to have to massively expand their asset market, and in particular their sovereign debt market. So we're a long ways away from the RMB becoming a major global reserve currency.
Okay, we are approaching to an end. We only have 5 minutes left. Any very urgent question from the floor? Then I want to take one question from the floor. No? Then let me just ask one question, generally speaking, about this issue. I want to talk about the G20. I mean, G20 was the very powerful group of countries, and they talk about the IMF restructuring, the IMF quarters. So right after the financial crisis, this G20 seemed to be working quite effectively, and they have quite good policy coordination. But at this moment, I don't see any effectiveness of G20. Do you think G20 should play some role, especially, for example, when we talk about normalizing the unconventional monetary policy among major countries. Do we need any coordination through organizations like G20? Of course, G20 lost credibility because of the U.S. Congress doesn't really approve, what they decided. So any kind of ideas or evaluation of the G20 very quickly from Ben first.
Well, I hate to be overly cynical, but I think I'm going to be overly cynical. I don't think the G20 ever really worked that well. The reason that you got quote-unquote coordination at the beginning of the crisis is that everybody was happy to spend more money, which was what was required at the time. Now, of course, national interests are very divergent. And so it's difficult to get people to agree on common policies when they disagree as to what the fundamental problem is.
Then we are in trouble. We are in very uncertain world, but no leading kind of group or institutions leading to us to more stable financial situation. And Mr. O, please.
My own impression is that the 20 is too many. Yes, it is. We see the countries, even like Argentina, for example. Still, I'm not quite sure why Argentina is in the G20. And I think maybe 10 or even just 8 or 9 is the maximum. 20 is too many.
We have a G7, maybe we have different combination, but
yes,
G7.
so, but right now, for example, in the previous G7 countries, we have a larger Eurozone. Or maybe even the the European Union. So I think maybe it is the UK, France, the Germany and Italy is the same country, basically, the same economy. So I think maybe you should. So bottom line is that maybe that's another goal of maybe the reform of the IFI, International Financial Institutions. G20, that was just an emergency organization. I don't think that it will work permanently because, again, it's too many members.
Troy?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, crises focus the mind, and that's what happened with the G20. Once you move out of that situation, as Ben was saying, interests diverge and countries go different directions. But ultimately, I think fundamentally, it's a global governance question, which is how do we find a way to take and have effective governance and that can cut across different issues? Or do we have to take and go to discrete types of things, so, Basel with banking, and have specific types of committees to where maybe you have different combinations of countries that focus on those discrete issues? Or is it possible to have an overarching group? More than likely, I think, you're right. If we do, it's going to have to be a smaller group. But even the G7, people had questions about effectiveness on, especially in non-crises periods.
Okay, with this, I would like to conclude this session, but I cannot make any conclusion out of our discussion. But as I said, I'm an expert on I self-declare that I'm an expert on trade, and we often talk about the global governance on trade. Terrible situation, nothing is going on to any kind of direction. And if I hear from finance area, we are surviving, but without the major collapse, but we are still also in a very uncertain environment. So I don't know how the private sector people are thinking about the future with this kind of very uncertain financial environment. But with that note, I want to conclude this session. I want to ask audience to join me in giving a big round of applause to our panelists.